The brain is divided into 4 regions, and I'm going to present these regions in the order that both your book and lab manual cover them. They are the cerebrum, which is divided into 2 hemispheres, the diencephalon, shown here in purple, the brainstem, shown in green, and finally the cerebellum. If you are asked to identify a region, the answer is one of these 4. So be very keen to observe the wording of a question. These are the 4 regions of the brain. First, let's look at the cerebrum. The cerebrum by far is the largest region. In fact, the cerebrum represents more than half of the brain by mass. As I mentioned, the cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres by this deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. The outer portion of the cerebrum is known as the cerebral cortex, and it is thrown into these folds, and these folds are known as gyri or singular gyrus, and grooves, which are referred to as sulci or singular sulcus. A very important sulcus is the central sulcus. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes. We'll talk about lobes in the next slide. It's a very important landmark because it separates the precentral gyrus, which is also known as the primary motor area, from the post-central gyrus, which is also known as the somatic sensory area. The cerebrum is separated into lobes, and these lobes come in pairs. There's one on each cerebral hemisphere, and the lobes are named after the cranial bones that lie over top of them. We have the frontal lobe, here the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobes. The outer layer of the cerebrum is known as the cerebral cortex. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree, the outer layer of a tree. So the outer layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. It is composed of gray matter because that's where the neuron cell bodies of the cerebrum are located. Deep to the cortex, we have the white matter. White matter of the cerebrum is composed of myelinated nerve fibers. So this is where the fiber tracts of the cerebrum are located. This is a sagittal view of the brain, and it shows a very important fiber tract of the cerebrum, which is the corpus callosum. You'll be identifying the structures of the cerebrum on a brain model that looks like this. This is a superior view of the brain model. I'm going to point out some of the features. So this is, of course, the cerebral cortex that you're looking at. All of this is the gray matter. This is the central sulcus, separating the precentral gyrus or primary motor area from the post-central gyrus or somatosensory area. This is the longitudinal fissure, which separates the right and left hemispheres. This would be the frontal lobes here. These would be the parietal lobes here. Remember that the central sulcus separates the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. This is a lateral-posterior view of the brain. As a point of reference, here's our central sulcus again. So this is the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe. This is the temporal lobe here, and then we have the occipital lobes here on the posterior side of the brain. Also, this is the cerebellum. The transverse fissure separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So that'd be about right here. There are just a couple of structures that I want to point out. So this is the underside of the brain, or you could say this is an inferior view of the brain. And the only structure I want to point out are these olfactory bulbs shown here. These are the olfactory bulbs. On this mid-sagittal section of the brain, the only structure I want to point out of the cerebrum is that corpus callosum. Again, this is the white matter, the big fiber tract that runs between the two hemispheres. And again, that's the corpus callosum. On your study guide, you will see that you are responsible for identifying structures of the cerebrum on a sheep brain. And we have two sheep brains here. The one on the right has its dura mater surrounding it. This is this thick outer layer here. And the one on the left, the dura mater has been removed. However, there is pia mater. Now you can't, it's hard to visualize the pia mater because it is so thin and it is attached directly to the cerebral cortex, but it does give the brain or the cerebral cortex like this glistening like appearance, the lights bouncing off of it, and that's because of the pia mater. There is no arachnoid. The preservative in which these sheep brains are stored destroys the arachnoid, so there's no arachnoid on these. I'm going to focus on this sheep brain without the dura mater on the left as I point out the different features that you're responsible for identifying. Here is the central sulcus. It is more anterior in the sheep brain than the human brain because the sheep does not have as large and developed a frontal lobe. So if this is the central sulcus, then this is the frontal lobe, and then what's behind there is the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe would be like about here and here. This is the longitudinal fissure separating the right and left hemispheres. And lastly, this is the transverse fissure here separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. We're now looking at the underside of the sheep brain, and here you are able to see the two olfactory bulbs. They are much larger in sheep compared to the human brain proportionally, because sheep have a much better sense of smell compared to humans. We don't have a very good sense of smell. From this view, you can also see the temporal lobes, and you can see a bit of the occipital lobe, and the frontal lobe, of course. You're now looking at a mid-sagittal section of the sheep brain, and we're using this view so I can show you the corpus callosum. Remember that large fiber tract that we just saw in the human brain model that connects the left and right hemispheres? Here it is in the sheep brain. Our last sheep brain section is going to be a frontal section. So if we took our sheep brain and we cut it about there and then looked at the section we created, it would look something like this. There are three features that I want you to take note of. One is the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. Gray matter is where we have our cell bodies, and then underneath that gray matter is the white matter. That white matter consists of the myelinated axons from those cell bodies of the cerebral cortex. Lastly, notice that we have on either side of the midline these cavities, and these cavities are ventricles. They're sometimes referred to as lateral horns or the lateral ventricles.